The desert night slammed against the windshield of the station wagon like a solid wall. Inside, the cabin was cold. Jess kept her hands locked on the steering wheel, her knuckles bleached white under the dim dashboard lights. Every few seconds, a gust of wind hammered the car, forcing her to fight the drift. Behind her, the wooden desk shifted. It slid across the floorboards with a sharp, grinding screech that cut through the low hum of the engine. She winced, the sound echoing in the confined space like a footfall. She glanced into the rearview mirror. The road behind her was a jagged ribbon of black, swallowed instantly by the darkness. No headlights, no distant markers, just the empty, suffocating silence of the basin. She felt the weight of the night pressing inward, making the air in the car feel thin. She glanced at the rearview mirror again, her pulse jumping. She searched the dark expanse behind the rear seat, looking for movement, for a flicker of light, for anything other than the void. She gripped the wheel tighter, pushed the accelerator, and kept moving into the dark. The silence of the road was absolute until it shattered. Twin beams of light exploded into existence behind her, white hot and blinding in the rearview mirror. Jess flinched, her eyes stinging as the glare filled the cabin, erasing the familiar darkness. Before she could process the sudden intrusion, a heavy, metallic thud vibrated through the frame of her station wagon. The red truck had surged forward, slamming into her bumper with enough force to shove the car forward on the asphalt. The impact jolted her chest against the seatbelt. She gasped, her grip on the steering wheel slipping as the car fishtailed slightly. The truck did not pull back. It pressed against her, its engine roaring in a rhythmic, aggressive surge. Then came the sound. The horn began to blare, a constant, frantic wail that drowned out the wind and the hum of her own engine. The high beams remained locked on her, searing through the rear glass and turning the interior of her car into a bright, sterile box. She was no longer alone on the road. The danger was pressed directly against her, pushing her toward the edge of the shoulder. Jess fought to keep the station wagon steady as she veered onto the gravel shoulder. Tires sprayed loose stones against the undercarriage with a frantic, rhythmic rattle. Dust billowed up in a thick, gray cloud, choking the air and catching the glare of the lights behind her. She slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt as the red truck surged alongside and cut sharply across her path. It stopped inches from her bumper, an immovable barrier of steel. The blinding high beams didn't dim, they remained fixed, searing through her rear window and turning the cabin into a cage of white light. The horn continued its relentless, piercing wail, vibrating through the dashboard and into her hands. The sound was deafening, a constant mechanical scream that made the glass rattle in its frames. Jess sat frozen, her chest heaving, trapped between the wall of the desert night and the suffocating proximity of the truck. The dust began to settle, but the glare remained, pinning her in place. She pressed her back against the seat, eyes locked on the rearview mirror, waiting for the engine to cut or the doors to open. Outside, the engine of the truck idled with a deep, heavy thrum that shook the ground beneath her tires. The horn cut out, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Jess gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, and pulled. The heavy door groaned as she shoved it open, stepping out into the biting desert air. Her boots crunched against the loose gravel and rocks, the sound unnaturally loud in the void. She moved toward the rear of the station wagon, squinting, shielding her eyes against the piercing white glare of the truck's headlights. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight. She reached the back bumper, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then, the driver's side door of the red truck swung wide. A tall, broad silhouette emerged, dark and solid against the artificial sun of the high beams. The figure did not call out. It did not hesitate. It planted its feet firmly on the ground and began to walk, each step slow, measured, and deliberate. Jess froze, her breath catching in her throat as the shape grew larger in the blinding light. The distance between them shrank with every passing second. The figure kept coming, eyes locked on her position, moving with the heavy, predatory rhythm of something that knew exactly what it was doing. She stood paralyzed, unable to look away, as the silhouette filled her field of vision. The figure reached out, its hand slicing through the blinding light. That single movement shattered the spell. Jess spun, her boots slipping on the loose rocks, and scrambled back toward the driver's side door. She lunged inside, falling onto the seat as the truck driver broke into a sprint. She slammed the door shut, the metal frame rattling under the force, and jammed the lock down. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with the keys. She jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life, a desperate, guttural sound in the quiet desert. She didn't wait. She slammed the gear shift into drive and punched the accelerator. Tires spun, biting into the gravel, spraying stones against the chassis. The station wagon fishtailed, the rear end swinging wide before the treads caught the edge of the asphalt. She jerked the wheel, straightening the car, and gunned the gas. The speedometer needle climbed as she pushed the engine to its limit. Behind her, the red truck did not hesitate. It surged forward, its headlights filling her rearview mirror again. The gap between them vanished instantly. She was no longer standing still. She was a target in motion, racing into the dark with the heavy thrum of the pursuer vibrating through the frame of her car. The station wagon hit 80, the frame vibrating with a high-pitched whine. Jess gripped the wheel, her knuckles locked against the leather. Every time the car hit a pothole, the wooden desk in the back shifted. It scraped against the interior panels with a sound like heavy measured footsteps. Thump, slide, thump. The noise cut through the roar of the engine, syncing with the rhythm of her own frantic pulse. She glanced into the rearview mirror, but the darkness behind her only held the twin, unwavering beams of the truck. They were inches away, a constant, blinding presence that refused to fall back. She swerved to avoid a dip in the asphalt, and the desk slammed against the rear door with a violent crack. It sounded exactly like a boot kicking the metal. She flinched, her eyes darting between the road and the mirror, half expecting to see a hand gripping the rear window frame. The truck surged, its bumper tapping her own with a sickening crunch of metal. She floored the pedal, but the distance did not grow. The red truck remained tethered to her, a predatory shadow forcing her deeper into the desert night. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps, but she kept her foot pinned to the floor, terrified of what would happen if the engine failed. The horizon finally broke. Ahead, a cluster of fluorescent lights pulsed against the black desert expanse. A parking lot. Jess didn't brake. She threw the steering wheel hard to the right. The station wagon skidded across the loose gravel, tires screaming in protest as the vehicle drifted sideways. She fought the slide, corrected, and slammed the car to a halt directly beside a parked ambulance. The silence that followed was deafening. Her chest heaved, the air in the cabin thick with the smell of scorched rubber and ozone. She turned the key, killing the engine, and the sudden quiet made her ears ring. Then, the crunch of gravel returned. The red truck rolled into the lot, its motion slow and deliberate. It stopped 30 yards away, facing her. The headlights remained on, pinning her against the seat. The truck's engine did not cut out. It idled with a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the pavement and into her own feet. The driver made no move to exit. He simply sat there, a dark, motionless shape behind the glass, watching. Jess sank low, pressing her back against the door, her eyes locked on the truck. The standoff had begun, and the silence was heavy with the weight of an unseen threat. Minutes stretched into an agonizing sequence of heartbeats. The truck remained a silent monolith, its headlights cutting through the night like twin swords. Jess did not blink. Her fingers dug into the upholstery, her knuckles aching from the strain. Inside the station wagon, the silence grew heavy, pressing against her eardrums until she could hear the blood rushing in her own head. Suddenly, a sharp, wood-on-wood snap echoed from the back of the car. The desk had shifted again. She whipped her head around, eyes wide, breath catching in her throat. The back seat was empty, shrouded in deep, suffocating shadows. She turned back to the windshield, her pulse hammering against her ribs. An hour passed in this state of suspended animation. Finally, the truck shifted. The gears ground against the stillness as it reversed, slowly circling the perimeter of the lot. The headlights swung away, cutting a long arc through the dust, before the vehicle vanished into the total darkness of the highway. Jess did not move. She sat frozen, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the predator had been, unable to reconcile the sudden absence of the threat with the terror still vibrating in her nerves. 5 years had smoothed the sharp edges of the memory, or so she told herself. Jess sat on her couch, the room bathed in the erratic, cold blue light of a television screen. A crime documentary played, the narrator discussing a series of cold cases along the Colorado-Arizona highway. She focused on the screen, her grip tightening on the edge of a throw pillow. Then, the footage shifted. A grainy, reconstructed image appeared, showing a red pickup truck identical to the one that had hunted her. The narrator detailed the driver's signature, baiting motorists, forcing them to the shoulder, and disappearing into the desert. Jess stopped breathing. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin pale against the dim room. She remembered the weight of the silence in that parking lot, the way the truck had idled, and the absolute certainty of the threat. The screen displayed the victim count, all women, all intercepted on that same stretch of asphalt. She realized with a jolt of ice in her veins that she had not just been chased by a stranger. She had been mocked by a killer. The documentary continued, but the sound became a dull, distant hum. She stood up, her legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the window. The reality of that night finally stripping away her false sense of security. The glass of the window was cold against her forehead. Outside, the night was a vast, featureless void, mimicking the desert that had nearly claimed her 5 years ago. She stared at her own reflection, her eyes wide and searching. Then, for a fraction of a second, the light shifted. A dark, broad silhouette flickered into view, standing directly behind her in the glass. Her heart lurched. She spun around, her hands balled into fists, ready to defend herself against a ghost. The living room was empty. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the television from the other room. She walked to the center of the space, checking behind the door, under the table, into the hallway. But there was nothing but shadows and the silence of a house that offered no sanctuary. She stood still, her breath hitching in her chest as the realization set in like a winter frost. The truck had left the parking lot years ago, but the hunt had never stopped. The road did not end at the horizon. It had wound its way into her home, into her mind, and into the very air she breathed. She was still on that shoulder, still watching the mirrors, forever waiting for the headlights to find her again.